In this video, I will talk about how much you can trust carbon offsets. Because carbon offsets are a way for one country or company to buy CO2 reductions from another. But in the past, allegations have been made that the supposed CO2 emission reductions from carbon credits never actually happened. So in other words, the carbon credits might be empty air. And this is important going forwards because the European Union has indicated that up to 5% of their 2050 emission reduction goals could be done through carbon offsets. So how much can we trust them? Well, to answer this, a team of researchers worked together to do a meta-analysis of the literature, which they published in Nature. And what they did is that they synthesized the existing literature, eventually selecting 14 studies on 2,346 carbon mitigation projects. And these studies, when taken together, covered about 1 billion carbon credits, and that 1 billion credits covered industries like renewable energy, forest management, cooking stoves, chemical processes, and so on. Now what they find is that of those 1 billion credits, only 16% actually led to CO2 emission reductions. So in other words, for every 5 carbon offsets you bought, 4 will be literally empty air. Now this to me is a disappointing result. It shows that many of those carbon offsets are kind of fake. However, these credits were mostly created under the Kyoto Protocol. And that matters a lot because later in this video, I will discuss how under the new Paris Agreement Article 6, there are some very promising developments to make better criteria. But to understand the new, first we must understand how this went so wrong. And here, averages can be misleading. And I call this the Tolstoy carbon credit principle. Tolstoy, in his famous book Anna Karenina, said that all happy families were alike. But all unhappy families were unhappy in their own way. Well, in their study, the authors found that all good projects had similar criteria they satisfied, but all unsuccessful projects failed in their own specific way. So let's talk about the ways in which the different projects failed. So let's start with renewable wind energy. Offsets for wind energy turbine projects led to essentially zero emission reductions, or in other words, an offset achievement ratio of 0. Now, what does the offset achievement ratio mean? It is the ratio of the estimates that the study thinks happened, so the actual emission reductions, relative to the emission reductions claimed by the project developers. So an offset achievement ratio of 0 means essentially no actual emission reductions. So what is the reason these offsets from wind energy were so poor? The reason is that the wind turbines would have been built anyway, regardless of the additional money from the offset. This is because it takes a lot of money to build wind turbines. And the money from the offset is tiny in comparison with the total amount of money needed. So in other words, these wind turbine projects were going to happen anyway, regardless of the additional money of the offset. So you can't really say that these offsets reduced emissions when they were going to take place anyway. That is called the principle of additionality. The money you put in has to achieve the actual reductions. And it's one of the key fundamental principles of carbon offsets. Now, a second type of project is related to forests. In this category, you have projects that seek to improve forest management. What does that mean? Well, basically lowering harvest rates. And here, the study finds that carbon credits, again, essentially were meaningless with an offset achievement ratio of 0. So what's the reason here? Well, the idea here is that the way reductions were measured was relative to an average of the region. And what happened is that lands that were kind of already harvesting less were more likely to enroll, and that these regions were then claiming offsets relative to the average baseline, but they already had much lower harvesting rates. So on paper, it would look like you're reducing your harvest rates relative to this average, but in reality, there was no such thing because they essentially just had lower harvest rates to begin with. So the project can end up rewarding participation, not impact. And that's a type of adverse selection. Projects that join are the ones that can generate credits without changing much. And a similar thing happened with projects on avoided deforestation. That is where you avoid deforesting a region altogether. In other words, you avoid having a forest being used for other purposes like buildings. The results here were slightly more encouraging, as 25% of credits corresponded to real emission reductions. Still not great, but already better. And here the issue was also unrealistic comparisons. The way these credits were counted was that project developers used deforestation baselines methodologies that were again too optimistic. They basically used historical deforestation rates and said this was going to happen in the future. But that was likely never to happen in the first place if you analyzed the regions in more detail. In addition, you have other reasons like poor administrative targeting, adverse self-selection, and non-compliance. Now let's look at another type of project, Cookstoves. Cookstove projects come in at an achievement offset ratio of around 11%. So only 10% of credits led to real estimated reductions in CO2. Now with Cookstove projects, the idea is that you help households install a more efficient cookstove, going from older and dirtier cookstoves to more emissions-friendly cookstoves. And these cookstoves can have a lot of potential. I already covered one paper in a video where the results were really positive and very promising. However, there are several reasons why the results in this meta-study were so discouraging when looking across projects. And the reasons were threefold. Because methodologies often were too lenient on 1. Calculating the percentage of non-renewable sources of fuel wood and other biomass used by the cookstoves. Second, how much the new and old stoves are actually used. It's kind of logical. If you get a new stove but you don't actually use it, not much is going to happen. And then 3, how those two elements then actually combine to emission reduction. In other words, once again, it is a story that if your assumptions were optimistic and not actually grounded in reality, empty credits can quickly arise. Now, I should also mention that the overestimation of credits might not be ill-intentioned. It might just be that the project developers were doing their best, but likely too optimistic about the benefits. I have another video that analyzes this in the context of home insulation technology. And what you find is that engineering estimates sometimes just fail to account for the human element. And then the final category of this paper that I want to discuss is industrial gas projects. These are projects that pay companies to reduce their use of high emission gases. For example, there's the HFC 23 gas. And these projects can look excellent on paper. Besides being very emission intensive, these gases are also very measurable. So there's no similar problem like the cookstoves or deforestation rates where you're kind of making educated guesses on what the counterfactual would be. So on paper, these come in at 68%. So a much better result. There is a dark twist, however. When credit revenue is huge, it can create perverse incentives. If you get paid to destroy a pollutant, you might have a reason to generate more of it than you otherwise would before the program started, just to get paid to destroy it. For example, 2 projects lowered their HFC 23 waste gas generations in periods where they could not claim credits. Now, methodology rules were later updated to prevent this type of effect happening. Which brings me to the more optimistic point. As I mentioned before, these credits were mostly generated under the Kyoto Protocol, a system adopted in 1997. Now there is a successor, the Paris Agreement Article 6. And this is an attempt to fix the gaps in credibility. There has been an attempt to make better guidelines to make sure that a lot of this stuff does not happen again. And I have a podcast interview with Bia Granziera on this, where we go into a lot of detail of what's new, what has been changed, what's being developed. So if you're more interested in that, I recommend checking out that podcast. Now, does that mean the problem is solved? Obviously not. You still have to watch for the same old issues. Weak additionality, inflated baselines, reversals, and incentives that might reward volume instead of real climate results. But it does mean the story isn't over, and the more interesting question now is whether the new system can actually do better than the old one. Thanks for watching. If you like this, please leave a like or subscribe. I really appreciate it. Otherwise, if you've got any questions, leave them in the notes below. I also will have a link below to the transcript where you can find references to the paper itself, and a podcast interview that I did with one of the authors about this paper if you want to learn more or have a deeper dive. So thanks for tuning in. See you around.